to share this work with you. As Portia said, it's been a result of several years of research by a large number of people, including many people here today, and I'm really excited to share the results of the research. So with that, we have a pretty tight agenda. I don't know if Portia mentioned, sorry. We have 2 talks. So if back-to-back talks, God help me. One is on a 3-year study of Santa Cruz Cypress, and another is on a multi-year effort for Santa Cruz wallflower, Ben Lomond wallflower. So feel free to come back later if you just want the wallflower talk. Leave early, obviously, if you just want the cypress talk. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Let's see, share my screen. All right, can everyone see that title slide okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, thanks so much. All right. So in this talk about the wallflower, I'm going to share a little bit of background about the species, enough to get you going if you're not familiar with it. We'll talk about the study goals, objectives, and different components. Then we have 4 main topics: the Martin fire and its effects on Santa Cruz Cypress, the CZU lightning complex fire and its effects, a stand mapping study that we did, and an overall assessment of threats to persistence. And finally, we want to talk about some of the conservation and management needs for the species. And I really want to say at the outset that this is hopefully the beginning of many meetings that we'll have amongst many of you here today, as well as others perhaps, to help formulate an ongoing path forward to conserve the species. I know we won't have a ton of time to take all the questions we'd like and have a robust discussion, but again, I hope this is the first of many. So I do want to start, since I'm going to probably run out of time at the end, with some acknowledgments of everyone who contributed to this project. As Portia mentioned, it's funded by a Section 6 grant, which was originated by the Fish and Wildlife Service, provided to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and on to the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council, and numerous people, JMC staff, interns, and then lots of helpers throughout the field of work contributed to this project from state parks, San Mateo County parks, and others. So thank you all so much for all of your contributions to this work. We have our obligatory selfie that we take at the end of every field day, just a proof that we somehow survived. These are the smiling, happy faces that contributed to all the hard and challenging and yet very rewarding fieldwork. So thank you all. And I do want to then give a special shout out to who just arrived, Terrace Castine, my partner in crime for the 3 years on this project for wallflower and cypress. Also Todd Lemaine, who's here today from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Terrace and Todd gave rise to this project and invited me to participate, which I really appreciate. And then also Connie Rutherford from the Fish and Wildlife Service, no longer there. She got me started on cypress, 15, 20 years ago. And Angelica Mesquita, who's here today too from my team. She's helping out with a lot with this report and did some of the early cone collection with me. So thank you all. All right, with that, I will jump in. So Santa Cruz and Butano Cypress, for those of you who know, it's a little bit of a primer. They're very rare paleoendemic taxa from the Santa Cruz Mountains. The taxonomy has been changing forever. We could spend a whole talk just on that, but I won't. Just suffice it to say that there are currently 2 different infraspecific taxa, Santa Cruz cypress and Butano cypress, but a lot of times they're collectively referred to still by some of us, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, as Santa Cruz cypress. I'll probably just call them cypress most of the time today. But do know that I know that Butano cypress is a different variety, and but for purposes of conservation management, we've been kind of treating them a lot similar. They're endemic to the western slope of the Santa Cruz Mountains. There's 1 population of Butano cypress and 4 populations of Santa Cruz cypress. And they're all found on oligotrophic, which just means nutrient poor, droughty soils that are derived from sandstone and decomposed granite. They co-occur with knobcone pine and a maritime chaparral community, and then kind of in a matrix of oak woodland, mixed evergreen forest, coast redwood forest. And so kind of here's a map just to give you a snapshot if you're not familiar with the distribution of Santa Cruz cypress. They go from Wilder Ranch State Park down here, Majors Creek Stand, up to Butano, which is in Pescadero Creek County Park. And the acreages kind of are hard fought, including up to this study, but about 216 acres total occupied habitat as of the most recent 5-year review by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is a very rare patchily distributed species. Again, paleoendemic, many eons ago. It was probably much more widespread, and this is the kind of the remaining areas to which it's restricted. In terms of conservation status, it's been endangered, state listed endangered since 1979, federal endangered since 1987. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service downlisted it to threatened in 2016, a result of some of the successful work to protect habitat since it was originally listed, reduce some of the threats. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife also listed as a Santa Cruz Cypress stands as a sensitive natural community that affords some protection. And it's a County of Santa Cruz special forest. And so that the county local level, all the land and supports Cypress and Santa Cruz County is county land use control. So that's helpful as well. In terms of the land protection status, you can see about 69% of the acres are protected in some form, mostly with public ownership. The Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve is California Department of Fish and Wildlife, but the rest of the population is adjacent on private land. The Butano population or variety is County of San Mateo County Parks. The Eagle Rock is all part of Big Basin State Park, and the Majors Creek population is all partly part of Wilder Ranch State Park. Some of it's private. So there's your conservation status. So the fire ecology is a huge part of what makes Santa Cruz Cypress so interesting and fascinating, and also why we're here today. It's also what the most challenging parts of its conservation and management. It's a closed cone tree, so the cones stay closed up on the tops of the trees until some sort of damage breaks the vascular connection and opens them up. So that is typically fire, but can also be just breaking of the vascular due like a broken branch or something. And that drops the seed, though fire typically drops the seed on the ground. You get nice open canopy, bare soil that promotes the seedling establishment. And then that also creates highlight conditions that allows the juveniles to enjoy good growth, and then you get more trees. So we think that the tree cones are produced in about 6 to 7 years after fire. That's from the literature, but I kind of stay tuned for an update on that as part of this project here. The natural fire return interval is really largely unknown. There's a lot of speculation about what it could be based on the life history and ecology, but no one's done fire history recreation in these stands, and the historical fire information is very hard to pin down. But cypress trees themselves have very thin bark, unlike redwoods, which are actually pretty closely related. So they're killed by the fire. And so they basically think they all die. Think about 50 to 100 years is probably what it takes to get the seed established and have the next cohort of trees survive and then reproduce. More on that though. So there's lots of threats to persistence when you're extremely rare and only occupy about 216 acres. Here's kind of a rundown. I won't list them all or go into them all. We'll be talking more about them, but these are all things that have been covered in the recovery plan and the 5-year reviews for the species and are important to keep in mind. Wildfire, though, is kind of the key topic of today. They're fire adapted, of course, and so for many years, we were wringing our hands, and the recovery plan wringed its hands about fire exclusion and what's going to happen with that. But then in 2008, we had an illegal campfire that turned into a wildfire in Bonnie Doon, burned 460 acres, including 35% of the about 197 acres that's occupied by cypress. So that's here. You can see the Martin fire. The Bonnie Doon stands fire history is a little murky for me. If any people want to put in the chat what you know about it, that would be great. I've been having a hard time piecing it together. It seems like it might have burned, or part of it might have burned in the 1948 Pine Mountain fire, but it's not clear. Then in 2020, the CZU Lightning Complex fire, which I might just call CZU fire or just CZU today, started in August. There was quite a flurry of lightning strikes, as many of you know, that ended up spreading out and burning over 86,000 acres, including most of the Santa Cruz Cypress stands. It basically burned all of Brackenbray, all of Butano, all of the Eagle Rock stands, and then about 76% of the Majors Creek stand. Did not burn, it burned in Bonnie Dune and it burned part of the Ecological Reserve, but did not burn any of the area that's occupied by cypress. So in this study, like I said, Terrace and Todd got together and said, we need to know more about what the implications of these fires and the CZU in particular is for long-term persistence of cypress. So that was our goal. Obviously we looked at a lot of factors as part of this study. I'll go through them, but our overall approach was to look at the Martin fire first. And see how that population is doing now, 14 years after, and then take a look at the CZU fire stands, and then map all the stands to get good data about where they occur. So there's a 3-year study between 2022 and 2024. We did different elements of the study each year. In the first year, we sampled a bunch of demography trees. These are trees that I had tagged and mapped in 2006, way before fire was starting up in this area. And we can monitor their long-term persistence. I won't talk too much about that because all of the demography trees died. So that ended up turning into more interesting avenues and ways to explore that. In 2022, we also resampled the 2011 permanent plots that I established in Bonnie Dune following the Martin fire to look at the effects of the Martin fire. So we'll share a little bit today about some of the data comparing how the population there has done since 2011 to 2022. In 2023, we established a similar set of plots in the CZU fire affected population. And that spun into a little side project to look at the amount of seed that still remains in these populations that could potentially contribute to ongoing recruitment. And then finally in 2024, we mapped the pre-fire and post-fire distributions of all 5 populations. And a little side project that's not really part of this grant, but folks here helped out with, so I really appreciate that, was to control French broom in the Brackenbury population. All right, so I will start off with the Martin fire effects study. So as I mentioned, the Martin fire burned the Bonnie Dune population of cypress in 2008. It had so 3 years later, I got a grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service to go take a look at that. In the intervening time, there was a lot of interest in kind of trying to do vegetation management in cypress forest, Bonnie Dune in general. And so there was a VMP, if you guys are familiar with that lingo, a vegetation management plan project done in cypress that actually I'll tell you more about, but cleared some understory to try to look at the effects of that on cypress. So we decided to use both the Martin fire as a natural experiment plus that VMP to kind of do a comparative assessment of the effects of fire and the effects of manual clearing. To complement that, we also established 10 plots in completely unaffected areas by either of those, so basically intact habitat. We collected data on cypress abundance, so density in the plots, size, condition. We looked at different conditions, a lot of habitat conditions. I won't be talking about a lot of this. You can read about a lot of this in the report, but we wanted to look at various factors that might influence cypress. And so in this 2022 report, we're going to be talking about how the 2022 population and habitat condition is looking in those different areas burned, manually cleared, and unaffected, and also the changes since 2011. So again, I'm going to show you a lot of pictures and not bog you down with a bunch of data today because I think it's more fun to look at pictures. So here's some photos of what the cypress stand looked like in 2011, 3 years after the fire. There were 3 cohorts of cypress recruits, which was very exciting. Oh, the fire killed all the adult trees in the Martin Fire area. All the cypress, including like this large one here, they were all killed. But there was 3 cohorts of seedlings that established, and there may have been more after because we just did our study 3 years after. So we call them seedlings, juveniles, and large seedlings, small juveniles, and large adults because it got a little hard to tell them apart. But that's you can see we had quite a dense carpet of recruitment in the understory. So that was super exciting. Obviously the fire created nice open bare ground soil and open canopy. And kind of this photo compares the same plot in 2011 and 2022. So you can kind of play that forward, and we can ask the question, well, how has it changed in the last 11 years? As I mentioned, the fire killed all the trees and 39% of the habitat that was burned. In 2011, there were 945 post-fire recruits for every pre-fire adult that was killed. So that's a nice hefty ratio of recruitment, which we were really excited about. And I mentioned, like I said, three annual cohorts. Looking at 2022, I kind of very cautiously call this survivorship. It's not truly survivorship because there was potentially more. We know there was some more recruitment, but not much probably after 2011. But so the percent change in the population was that 20% of the trees, there's 20% as many trees in 2022 as there were in 2011. So you can say that's 20% survivorship loosely. So now we're down to 189 recruits per pre-fire adult. So a lot of that's due to self-thinning. That's a natural process, as many of you are familiar with closed cone trees and lots of plants, frankly, for that matter, that establish at high density, and then they kind of winnow themselves down as they grow up. There's also obviously regular interspecific competition between the cypress and other trees. Reproduction, we found in 2022 that 8.2% of the cypress were reproductive, so they had achieved the stage of producing cones, which was also very cool and very exciting. The seed cones, based on our analysis of where they were located on the trees, we determined they began to be formed in 2020, so that's 12 years post-fire. And there could have been some earlier producing trees that may not have been detected. But this is pretty consistent with the literature, but we'll come back to that later too. So here's some photos you can see of the post-fire conditions in the Martin Fire area in 2022. Quite a range of conditions from real open canopy, dense recruits, open canopy in the maritime chaparral, some cypress recruits growing in pretty dense knob cone pine. And then here's this picture showing some of those recruits with cones. Okay, so what were the effects of the manual clearing? So that VMP project I mentioned, in 2011, there was an average of 5 recruits per 25 meter square plot. So that's 0.5% of the burn area, which had, again, 945 recruits. And similar to the unaffected areas, there was basically no difference between the manual removal area and the control plots in terms of recruitment. And all the recruits occurred in one small area that had been raked. So that gave really good evidence to support that they need open bare ground soil to establish. In 2022, when we went back to these plots, none of those recruits had survived. So there was 0 survivorship, and we didn't say any new recruits either. So that stand that got treated for this vegetation management plan project is not doing any regeneration. And this was actually lower than the control plots. So the pre-treatment adults were still there. So they left the trees intact. But the adult density has declined 35%. So 35% of the trees that were there in 2011 had died. And a lot of it was due to windfall, perhaps being promoted by heart rot, which is kind of what happens as these trees get older. They just kind of rot from the inside out, and they're more susceptible to falling down. So here's what that looks like in the manual removal treatment area. You can kind of see in 2011, it was kind of a little bit more open understory. They kind of chopped up some dead trees, raked, made some piles. But you can see the soil, kind of stuck my ruler in the ground. It still had a lot of unburnt undecomposed organic matter that was still present on the soil surface. And so that largely deterred cypress establishment, except for in these kind of rare little areas and little pockets. And here's what it looks like in 2022. You can see the woody material all reaccumulated from the overstory of trees, and then a lot of trees fell down, as I mentioned. And it's not very different from the unaffected area, the control plots in that respect. So and these are, you can see the control plots at the same time, they saw a fair amount of wind throw as well. So those we had a lot of winds, as you guys know, if you live here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and those have contributed to a lot of wind throw and the unburned area. So what did we learn from that? I think we could say that prescribed burns, if people are thinking about doing prescribed burns, must simulate the beneficial effects of fire in order to be effective. You need to open up the cones, which probably isn't too hard, but most importantly, you need to remove the established trees to reduce the canopy and create high light conditions. This is not the system where you have like an understory treatment of any kind or understory burn. It's not going to work. And you really got to create that bare mineral soil conditions that consumes all the litter and ideally the organic matter on the soil. So the same thing would apply to any kind of fire surrogates, anything that we want to use to mimic the beneficial effect of a fire. It's got to create all those same conditions. So I think a recommendation is obviously that should be tested further for scaling those up to kind of widespread use in any kind of vegetation management. And I'll just put in a plug for this, which we'll talk more about later, is that all prescribed burn and vegetation management projects got to avoid introducing exotic plants. Cypress stands are really like Lomcombe pinefirst and maritime chaparral. They currently have really low exotic plant cover. The disturbance can promote those exotics though, and this did not occur in the Martin fire, which was super exciting. We were really worried about that. That French broom and everything else would come in. There's actually less than 1% cover of exotic plants, which is, you're hard pressed to find that anywhere in Santa Cruz County, I would think. So that was a bit of good news. We did get some invasion of French broom into that vegetation management plan area though. So anyway, designing projects so that you can remove invasives prior to treatment and then conducting early detection and rapid response are going to be critical to any kind of management of cypress growth. Okay, so with that, I'm going to roll right into looking at our effects of the CZU fire. So again, we went out the first year and took a look at all the demographic monitoring trees that we had tagged. As I mentioned, they all died, but we did learn some things that kind of segued nicely into our 2023 plot-based study, which I'll tell you about. And then we'll talk about the seed availability study and finally the stand mapping and threat assessment. So first, what did the fire do? CZU fire burned all of the Brackenbray, all Butano, and all the Eagle Rock, just to review populations, 76% of Majors Creek, and none of the occupied habitat in Bonnie Doon. So the burn severity, which is what this little screenshot map is showing, was pretty high or very high. Burn severity kind of measures like how much vegetation is removed. So areas, not surprising, that rock outcroppings and areas that had lower fuel or vegetation to begin with had lower burn severity. But conversely, the kind of chaparral understory and the dense cypress had very high burn severity. Let's see. These are some photos that Joey Santori, Botany Pays, as a Crime Pays, Botany Doesn't. It's a great podcast if you ever want to check it out on YouTube. He shared these with me. He went to the Butano stand in December 2020. And you can see the fire created the same regeneration niche, a very open canopy, open soil, burned off all there's ash here in these photos you can see, but otherwise opened up some nice seed on the ground there. The fire did kill most of the trees in the stands that were burned. So there were a few exceptions in Brackenbray, one of the populations that had that lower intensity fire that I mentioned. There's about 104 adults and 37 juveniles that survived in 26 locations kind of scattered throughout. So they're mostly in areas of rock outcrops like this that just didn't have enough fuel to carry the fire. But it's, a lot of them are really small and stunted, but they do have cones, and so these can be important seed trees going forward for ongoing regeneration. So we'll take it. Majors Creek also had some copses of trees that didn't burn for whatever reason, probably the reason being fire suppression to protect adjacent houses, and right next to the stand there. So there's some numbers there for you, less than an acre in each of those two stands that didn't burn. So we use that information to kind of inform our 2023 plot-based study, which we also kind of designed to be similar to the Martin study, so we can maximally compare data between the two studies and then compare the fires. So we had 10 5-meter by 5-meter plots in each of the 4 CZU affected populations. Because we had those kind of low intensity burn areas, we thought it would be kind of cool to see how cypress does in those areas and have those for long-term monitoring. So the goal of these plots, obviously, just to reiterate, was to look at the effects of the fire, but also set them up for long-term monitoring. So these are permanent plots. So we wanted to be able to monitor these other areas long-term as well. Collected pretty much all the same data. And you use the data to compare, to look at 2023 habitat and population conditions, compare the 4 populations, kind of statistically compare them and see how they differed, compare the complete and partial burn area, and we also compared the population and the habitat in the CZU areas to the Martin fire in 2011. So since they both occurred about 3 years after the fire. We don't have a chance to talk about very much of this at all. It'll all be in the report if you want to geek out on cypress ecology, biology. But I'll hit some highlights. So establishment. So first we got that great fire, good seedbed. Unfortunately, we had very low rainfall that first critical year after the fire. Super bummer. We got 21 inches. There's 22 inches, about 44% of the average rainfall in 2020, 2021. So the other years kind of picked up subsequently. We've had more rain with 2023 obviously being a great rainfall year, but of course the seed diminishes during that time period. So the cones are dropping the seed's getting eaten, dispersed, washed away, all that good stuff, losing viability due to intrinsic factors. So not surprisingly, we had diminishing cohorts. So there's 3 cohorts in our plots 3 years after. 75% were established the first year, 16% the second year, and just 8% the third year. During mapping, we also observed a 4th cohort in 2024, but it seems very small. So not just small individuals, but small in density. But we did get the cohorts, so that's exciting. Rather than showing you a bunch of correlations, I'll just tell you some stories about like what factors influence cypress with some photos. So I'll just kind of walk through them rather than even showing you this, maybe in the interest of time. Cypress did surprisingly well at the ecotones. The ecotone, as you know, is the area adjacent to the stand. And those areas were really dense forest in most cases prior to the fire. Cypress, you can kind of see poking their head out in here. Occurred at a remarkable density in some of the stands, like at Butano. The higher density is at the ecotone. And this is because that is the area that has the most soil and most thickest soil, most loamiest, best, most fertile soil compared to the interior of the stand. So it's probably a lot of reflection of that low rainfall that first year and that rainfall really limiting seedling establishment. Cypress are really big at the ecotone too. You can see this person is 6 feet tall. So dense shrubs, everyone's worried about shrubs. Understandably, everyone's worried about shrub cover and outcompeting cypress. We found evidence for some beneficial effects of shrubs and some kind of competitive effects of shrubs. And those effects probably differ depending on the site and the microsite conditions. So it's not a simple shrubs are bad thing. Shrubs may also be promoting with fertilization by nitrogen fixing. So we did see quite a bit of cypress in the shrub cover. The cypress preferentially established in drainages. You can see that here in this photo. This photo is great because it shows a couple different patterns. Cypress preferentially in the drainages and cypress away from exotic plants. But anyway, moisture was very limiting. These little places that water runs off or ponds or kind of seeps out of the soil were really helpful in establishing the cohort. And then conversely, areas that have a lot of rat-tail fescue and exotic grasses, or in the case of brackenbray, this dense stand of French broom that came in, were very bad for cypress, although they did establish underneath the French broom, or established, and then the French broom came in, is more likely. Trails also kind of preferentially have more cypress along them for probably a variety of reasons. Trails can be conduits for water, trails open up light, and then trails also occur a lot of times on ridges and stuff where the cypress preferentially occurred. So there is this association with the trails and the sites that have trails. And then cypress also occurred underneath cones. So you can see this kind of a dead cypress pre-fire adult that died and has cones still on it. And these are all these little green things are cypresses all around it. And including in the 4th year cohort, we continued to find. So that got us thinking in 2023, we have this really limited recruitment? Is it possible that we could still be getting a lot of recruitment from the pre-fire trees cones that still had seed in them? So as you can see here, the fire killed the trees, but they still have cones in them, and the cones featured very amounts of seed. And so our question was, how much seed is in there? Is it viable, and can it promote ongoing population growth? So we got another grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Thanks so much, Todd. And we were able to enlist the help of many highly effective interns from UC Santa Cruz to help with an aerial seed bank analysis, where we first we counted the number of cones in the plots, so we can kind of get a handle on how many cones were still on the ground. And then we collected cone clusters, brought them back to the lab, and we analyze by stand, basically quantify the amount of seed and the viability of the seed in the cone. So I won't go through all the details. You can read about that in the report, but it's fun stuff. We noticed some cool things with the cypress cone morphology, some of which has already been known, but cypress cones are highly variable among stands, which is kind of cool. That was the basis for actually separating the Butano cypress out. You can see Butano cypress over here, much larger than Majors Creek cypress. Seed size largely mirrored cone size. And then the cone seeds were largely intact. As you can see, mostly look like that here, but we did see some signs of damage that we kind of documented some of that. In terms of overall seed availability, the plots averaged about 304 cones per 25 meters squared. It's important to keep in mind that's not the same as across the landscape, because we had our plots our plots had to be located in an area with cypress. But anyway, there's about 87% of the cones contained at least one seed, and cones averaged about 59 seeds each. So there's a decent amount of seed in there. So we were super excited, sent the seed off to the lab. We work with a seed certified seed lab for a lot of our conservation rare plant projects. And unfortunately, the data came back, 4% of the seed was viable. So a lot of seed out there, most of it's not viable. So 89% of the seeds were empty. They just, according to the lab, they think they just lacked a fertilized ovule. I do wonder if the ovule was ever fertilized, which is very common in cypress, to not get full fertilization, of course, but then also could they have been senescent seed too? 9% of the seeds were dark and grainy, indicating that they were killed by the fire. Eagle Rock East, one of the stands, had lowest cone availability in terms of cones that had seeds. Most of the seeds were open and completely devoid of seed. It had the lowest germinable seed. In fact, there was no germinable seed in our 400 seed sample, and also had like most burned seed. And so I suspect that's kind of anecdotal. All that evidence suggests maybe a really intense fire over here. So we have this table in the report. You can take a look at it if you want to understand like the seed math, but basically we extrapolated all this out, seeds per cones per seed, viable seed, all kind of tells you the final answer of how much seed is out there. And we found that there's in areas that you have cypress and where there were cone clusters, which kind of limits it, there's about 51 viable seeds per meter squared, which is still, an amazing amount of seed, which is super exciting, but that was 2023. I'm not sure how much of that seed is still viable. So that kind of remains to be determined. So what does this mean for regeneration of cypress, and how does it compare to the Martin fire? I think these are some of our big questions. We calculated the ratio of cypress recruits to pre-fire adults, just like we did in Bonnie Doon. You remember that there was 945 recruits per adult in 2011 in Bonnie Doon, and it got down to 189 when we went back 11 years later. These are the numbers ranked in order from high to low for the CZU affected stands. And you can see it's kind of a much smaller amount, and these are recruits just 4 years post-fire. So the highest we have is 31, or 32 if you want to round up, in Majors Creek South, and it goes down to just 3 recruits per pre-fire adult in Eagle Rock East. So these are really low numbers, and I'm not sure that there's a good indication of what they portend for replacement, but it's probably not good given that these have to survive a long period of time till they reproduce, which we'll talk more about. Why was it so different from Bonnie Doon? I've thought a lot about it, and these are what I came up with. Bonnie Doon has deeper soil. The soil there is like actual real soil, at least in the area that burned. It's got zyanny soil, and a lot of the CZU stands are on rock, gravel, underlain by bedrock, really challenging conditions. Bonnie Doon is generally flatter terrain, and we did see a negative correlation between seedling establishment or recruit establishment and the CZU populations and slope. There's a lot of woody debris and litter on the ground in the CZU populations. They burn, and then just stuff just falling all over. I don't know that that's helping anything, and it was a lot less that way. There was fewer trees, and it was more open in Bonnie Doon. There's also reduced cover of co-occurring plants in Bonnie Doon, and then there were large pre-fire adults. The Bonnie Doon population just had some massive trees, which goes back to the deeper soils that they had. They were just huge, massive DBH trees. So if we take our survivor rates from Bonnie Doon, which I won't go into now, but we kind of have 2 different rates, one at the plot scale and one that's, excuse me, aggregated across the population. They're either 38% mortality and 80% mortality. If you take that and you multiply it by the mean, by the Santa Cruz recruits at the CZU plots, you're going to get down to, in 11 years from now, somewhere between 2.7 and 8.4 recruits per pre-fire adult, which is just 1 to 4% of what we have in Bonnie Doon. So not feeling terribly bullish about the recruitment and the population replacement, I guess. Not to whiplash you too much, but there's a little bit of good news from this study. In 2024, when we returned to do the mapping, we did see that cypress had begun to produce ovulate and staminate cones. So that we had actual seed cones out there in July of 2024 in 3 of the stands: Majors Creek North, Majors Creek South, and Butano. So that's pretty exciting. That's 4 years, less than 4 years after the first seedlings likely established, which was November 2020, if you go based on the rainfall that we got after the fire. So that's obviously really pushing the envelope of the prior reports, which was 2 years earlier than some anecdotal reports in the recovery plan, and then 7 years prior to some prior research that had looked at when Santa Cruz Cypress reproduces. And there's probably a good explanation for that. It's pretty obvious, I think. But in 2000, here's some pictures of cypress in 2006, which is kind of between the fires, which is when the prior researchers would have looked at cone production. And obviously, juveniles that are getting established under those conditions are getting established in really anemical soils, typically, any area that has open canopy, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to establish, right? So they're getting established in bedrock and thin soils, and those trees are going to go very slowly compared to in 2024, where it's been completely burned off and there was a lot of open soil and deeper soil, and so that's what allowed even this 2-foot tall cypress to produce cones, which was super exciting. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, and then I was going to make a note that Majors Creek North, if you guys know these systems, it has a real the gravelly decomposed granite soil, and that had we didn't kind of sample this quantitatively, but just anecdotally a lot higher percentage, still very low, but much higher percentage of cone producing plants. So something about that soil is definitely helping. Okay, so I'm out on time. Moving on, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the mapping work we did. and then try to wrap up. So our goal with the mapping was to recreate the pre-fire stands, so we know exactly, not exactly, there's nothing exact about it, but we wanted to know where Cypress was pre-fire and then where it is after the fire. And so we did this in all of the stands, including Bonnie Doon, which had never actually had Cypress mapped during an era of GPS and GIS technology. So it had just had some old topo maps. So let's see, this I will probably have to go through a little quickly. So first of all, I will say the mapping was very challenging, very steep terrain. And very large area to traverse, and also very brushy and difficult to access a lot of these stands. So we did our best, but we did try prior to jumping into field-based mapping, doing some remote sensing, using LiDAR and also hyperspectral image analysis to try to classify the pre-fire stand at least. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to do that with the post-fire stand of seedlings. We worked with a UCSC intern though, who did a project on this, and unfortunately found that the cypress and knobcone were conflated. Their signature is really similar, so we weren't able to get good differentiation. That's something that could still be pursued further in the future. But we did our best to map the stands. I'll explain to you how we kind of dealt with the uncertainty. Overall, we have like areas that we know are occupied by cypress. We were able to see them on the ground, map them on the ground. And then we have other areas where we think they're potentially occupied. We weren't able to verify they're there. We weren't able to rule it out either due to limitations that we had with this project. But so overall, we had a 3% increase in the area occupied and about a 9% decline post-fire in the area potentially occupied. So it's in essence, there wasn't a lot of change in the distribution of cypress. If you were, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. First, we were able to kind of document cypress in a greater area in Majors Creek as part of this study. This whole area outside of the green is the original stand boundaries that were known before our project, and then blue is where we were able to document it. So you can see we expanded that pre-fire stand. It's a 3.4 acre area, which is exciting. I'll also say that Dylan Neubauer contributed some data from her rare plant survey, on the San Vicente Redwoods property, where she found a 0.3 acre stand of cypress, which was very exciting. Obviously, it seems like some potential for additional cypress, or certainly suitable to unoccupied habitat between those, but it's a nice disjunct little patch that was found. So that expanded the pre-fire stands. Over in Eagle Rock North, this is Eagle Rock North stand, which is out in the middle of nowhere. If you know Blooms Creek and Jameson Creek. Off in the distance, we can see a couple trees here that look to be cypress. It would have been a very long ways to go try to get to them. So those are potential stand expansion to be verified. We also had some kind of confirmed contractions. I think some of the areas that had previously been mapped cypress, like at Eagle Rock East, this whole area here, we weren't able to find any evidence of any kind of cypress life for there before. And so I think that might have just been old mapping error, or they were extirpated long before the CZU fire. So now in terms of actual real population, now that we have our kind of better pre-fire stand boundaries, like what did the actual fire do to the cypress? Did they expand, which is what and that actually drops the seed in the adjacent forest. So we actually saw a lot of tree fall dispersal, basically. The fire opens up the canopy in those adjacent areas, and on those, as I mentioned before, the ecotone has much better soil, deeper, loamier soil. So I think it's just the long term, we just need to see if the cypress can persist in those areas. When we did the demographic monitoring back in 2006, the largest cypress trees are in those ecotones. So that's definitely the best place. If you didn't know this already, cypress doesn't really like the rock outcrops. It just can't compete and is killed by fire in the elsewhere. So post-fire expansion, these maps show you just kind of what that looks like. The blue is the pre-fire stand, the purple is the post-fire stand. So you can see we got Butano, which is very rare and its own variety, kind of expanding a little bit here on the margins. Same thing at Brackenbray. And the best pre-fire expansion occurred at Eagle Rock, which is a really, really small population, but expanded pretty dramatically south. We also had some post-fire contractions. This is areas where we had pre-fire adults that we could map and see. We know they were there, and we're not seeing any recruitment at all. Now, that doesn't mean it's not there, but we can, a lot of times we had pretty good visibility. So hopefully there'll be more recruitment and these won't be real contractions, but we did see those at Eagle Rock. This northern part up here lost them, and this northern part here in Eagle Rock North also appears to have lost Cypress. Okay, we also mapped for the first time the Bonnie Doon population. This map is really busy, I realize, but this kind of big blue kind of kidney-shaped thing is the original recovery plan map area. We walked throughout this area, a lot of help from folks on this call, so thanks so much, trying to look at all the publicly available land, the CDFW lands. There's a lot of private land in Bonnie Doon we didn't have access to. But we were able to map both the area pre and post fire and the Martin fire area, plus this unburned area in pink. So the purple and the pink kind of create collectively the Bonnie Doon population, which you can see is was thought to be about 128 acres. Now it's about 197 acres if you include both occupied, which is 106, and the potentially, and at least some of that's likely occupied, 91 acres. And again, 35% of that burned, 65% is unburned, and 45% is protected. So there's the Bonnie Doon Cypress breakdown for you. Okay, so for now, I want to just tell you a little bit about some of the threats to persistence, which many of which are not new. So I'll kind of run through these. Obviously, there's unprotected habitat, and it's subject to development. Obviously, I mentioned the county special forest protections are super key, but that's ongoing potential loss of cypress. Neighbor encroachment is also potentially occurring. A lot of times the boundaries, most of the cypress stand boundaries or protected lands are not signed or fenced, and so we're not actually sure if that was actually happening, but we did see some suggestion that maybe some things are occurring in the public lands, and also including roads. So there's some roads that got built that are either right in or just outside of the state park in Eagle Rock. Also there's vegetation removal before the fire, and then after the fire there's been a lot of removal of vegetation that is causing declines in habitat condition, including invasion of plants. I mentioned the French broom at Bracken Brae. That's the primary place, but there's a few other stands. Bonnie Doon and Eagle Rock also have this very dangerous invasive plant. Colonial bentgrass is a perennial grass that I don't know where it came from and how it got in, but it's spreading in Bracken Brae as well. And then you have things like rat-tail fescue, which are pretty widespread and patchily abundant, were there before the fire, but there can see cypress kind of growing in out of those, and they can cause declines in survivorship, basically. And you know, you can see a lot of chlorotic and desiccated plants. So here's all the mechanisms by which cypress can be impacted by exotics. A lot of the usual things, I think the ones I'll highlight that are not usual other than competition, there's the increased fire risk is huge. We'll talk more about immaturity risk, but the flashy fuels created by the grasses, the French broom creates kind of the horizontal and vertical contiguity of fuels, which can really take down these stands if we get another fire in them. So that's a big problem. Another one was the promoting herbivory. This one was surprising. When we went in to remove the French broom at the Bracken Brae population, which I'll talk about next, we found that a lot of the recruits had been chewed down by brush rabbits that are harbored by the French broom. So kind of turning that into a shrubland is not a good thing, it turns out, for cypress. So a little sidebar, we did kind of move from research to action in 2024. We got a Fish and Wildlife Advisory Commission grant to go after the French broom in Bracken Brae. So it was a community effort with CDFW and California Native Plant Society and RCD and a bunch of collaborators I'm probably not mentioning, so thank you everyone, to go after the broom. And they're working with the private landowner who provided us permission to do that, as well as conduct this study, so that was great. We got removed all the broom within the cypress stand, which is reducing the competition. We got rid of all the biomass, so there's not going to be as much fuel on the ground, and yeah, gave people an opportunity to get out there and learn about the species, which was great. hopefully will lead to future conservation action. Here's some before and after photos just to show you how nice it looks when you can get the French broom out of the cypress stand. Recreation is a threat. It's not a huge threat. It's not like widespread, but there's definitely some important areas of Cypress, like Majors Creek North, that have some unauthorized trails that are occurring where cypress occurs and damaging trees. People kind of cut the trees, people obviously driving over the trees. So, and then also it causes erosion and maybe potential for exotic plants too. Zooming way out from the site level stuff to climate change, whoa, that is going to be a huge issue. Cypress is has been used as like a case study for the effects of climate change. Take a really rare plant, take a long-lived plant, and you subject it to everything that's coming our way with climate change, and it's not a good outcome. So we got the climatic water deficit that's going to be increased by increased temperatures, increased frequency of intensity of drought, reduce fog, marine layer, and cloud cover now, they're even saying. And it's all going to probably spell high mortality for the recruits that we already are not having enough of. And then for the adults in the pre-fire areas, we're seeing the effects of the severe winds, the derechos or the straight line winds that came through. I mentioned before, blew over a lot of cypress mature adults. And then obviously it's going to increase the risk of fire too. Desiccation stress is a real threat in the cypress stands. Just they have really high solar radiation, insolation, and also really thin soil. Plants are established in bedrock a lot of the time, don't know even how they do it. So when we have this, increased climatic water deficit due to climate change, could create like a tipping point situation there. And then exotic plants are exacerbating the desiccation stress too. So controlling those can certainly help ameliorate that climate change impact. Okay, too frequent fire is a huge issue. If we get fire back on these stands before they have a chance to produce enough seed to regenerate, that's going to be a problem. We don't really know how long that is. 30 to 50 years of the numbers have been thrown around, but those aren't based on, I don't think, any empirical data or anything. So we just have to hopefully keep it out for a long time and get the trees going. Unfortunately, these stands are kind of high risk for fire due to the fuels, and the proximity to homes exacerbates that. And maybe you could say that the shrubs that have come in may exacerbate that as well. So Butano and Eagle Rock, some of the other ones are at really high risk for return of fire. And fire exclusion is still a threat. I know, we worried about immaturity risk is much more acute now, but certainly in Majors Creek South and Bonnie Doon, there's still potential that we would keep fire out so long that they would have not enough seed, and or the fire will come in, be so intense that it'll consume all the seeds in the cones, like we maybe saw at Eagle Rock, Eagle Rock East, where we're not having good recruitment. So that's still a concern. These are just some of the numbers, but Bonnie Doon hasn't burned since we think at least 1948 or maybe before. I'm not sure about the fire history at Majors Creek if anyone wants to chat that over. But it doesn't look as senescent as some parts of Bonnie Doon where we're seeing a lot of mortality. Okay, so conservation management recommendations, almost there. Okay, rather than giving you all the details, I kind of want to outline some action items, some next steps I think this conservation community should consider. One is preparing like a Santa Cruz cypress and Butano cypress conservation and management plan. I have a picture of the Sandhills Conservation Management Plan as kind of like a example, because I thought that was a great opportunity to bring together developer, conservation agencies, organizations, landowners, researchers, all together develop an overarching framework for conservation, given that there's a lot of different people involved. You can discuss everything from habitat protection and management and restoration to vegetation management, fire risk abatement, population enhancement, monitoring, and future research, and kind of have like an overall prioritization for some of those activities across the populations and stands, and identify implementation resources and entities. Sound good? Okay, great. So hopefully we can get a coordinated strategy for that. Obviously, with that strategy would address protecting remaining habitat. We got habitat Bonnie Doon, we got Brackenbrae, obviously, which is being subject to, I know, a lot of efforts, been subject to a lot of efforts for over 20 years to see that area protected, and I think hopefully that'll work out soon. There's also potential to protect suitable but unoccupied habitat, which I'm not going to have a ton of time to talk about, but I will share a little bit about as well. Just obviously some site level management plans. I think a lot of the sites don't have plans, or maybe their plans could be updated to address some of the threats to cypress, exotic plants, recreation, neighbor issues, preventing too frequent fire. All those things should be addressed at the site level where there's a lot of important nuance and site specific context information. Monitoring populations, put a plug in for that. We didn't just set this up to just be one top shop, but obviously we can, if you stay on this and monitor them, we can see how recruitment or how survivorship is, and also more importantly, identify and address new threats that can be ameliorated. If it wasn't for us being out there before, we wouldn't have seen the broom. So maybe having more eyes on the ground will help us detect and address future threats. I'll go through this quickly. I do think that there's time to think about expanding populations. So we got 20, basically 200 acres for this species, and it's very susceptible to demographic and environmental stochasticity. So we can increase resiliency quite a bit, long-term persistence, if we kind of consider potentially doing some introductions or maybe reintroductions, since it's a paleo endemic and a lot of the sites where it's not found, maybe it was before. I won't go into the detail here, but there's a lot of kind of good stepwise processes for doing introductions for rare plants. And you do a habitat characterization to figure out what they need. You go back out and you map the suitable but unoccupied habitat. I will show some of those maps that, just kind of here's Bonnie Dune, where you can see there's some really great suitable but unoccupied habitat that could be place where we can increase resiliency for cypress there. Majors Creek North has got a vast area of apparently suitable habitat that could be explored further. And then Brackenbray, same thing, both within the adjacent to the stand and this whole other area looks really good. Butano, not so much, which is super sad since that's the unique variety, but there is a nice patch along Butano Ridge Fire Road that could be looked at, and then this Eagle Rock North area. So lots of potential for that. Obviously, you need to do some small scale trials to figure out if it is the right habitat, if there's something else going on. And then, yeah, jump in and expand the populations like people have been doing for rare plants elsewhere. So with that, I'll just put in my plug for a call to action. Santa Cruz and Cypress and Butano Cypress are critically impaired. Hopefully you got that from this talk. Actions critically needed to prevent extirpations. And in the case of Butano Cypress extinction, going to need a lot of coordinated action from everyone here today, plus more people who aren't here today, including other NGOs and conservation organizations, landowners. And the post-fire period, I think, is going to be really critical window for doing this work. And we're already in that window and the window's going. But there's obviously, this is the most sensitive time, precarious time in terms of post-fire opportunities for invasions and things like that we already talked about, but also chances to advance population introductions potentially as well. So Cypress needs us, guys, and I know this is the Santa Cruz Mountains is a conservation community that can do it, so we're up to the task. With that, I don't know how much time I have for questions since it's 3 o'clock and we have another talk, but maybe I could just take a pause and stop sharing, and I'm sorry I went over and ate into our time. Maybe we could take a quick question, or we can put them over in the chat. Is anyone still there?
I'm here. This is Timothy Federal. I thought it was an awesome and really informative presentation. I think it'd be really cool there's about to be a veg map update coming out for the post-fire data that was collected for the fine scale veg map. It'd be really cool to compare the stands that you mapped with what was found in the veg map. I know what you did was finer resolution than the veg map will be, but it was cool to see those stands pop up even post-fire in the veg map data. So that's my only comment, not a question.
Thanks, Timothy. Appreciate it. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes, when will the report be available? Great question. As soon as we can get it out. I'm working very hard to get it out, this presentation, let's say early next month, since March is rapidly wrapping away. What else? Any other questions? Well, send along. You have my email address if you don't.
I got a quick one.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Matt.
God, 10, 15 years ago, Bill DeVille and I came across At the top of West Drive, I think in Lompico, there were a couple of Santa Cruz cypress, dying Santa Cruz cypress. I noticed it nowhere in this information. I know it was in a deeply wooded area, was not open, and they were overshadowed by pines and firs. Is that a potential area for expanding populations?
Yeah, I mean, in short, we didn't talk about, and we did mention the report that it was beyond the scope to run down every Santa Cruz cypress, and there have been reports from that one I'm aware of, plus also Swanton, the Bonnie Doon Quarry area. There's a few other kind of scattered observations of Santa Cruz cypress. I think it's important to note those could all be absolutely natural. They could be, really legit. It's also been propagated and planted a bit over the last 30 years or so. And yeah, in terms of, it could be sandhills habitat. Sandhills and cypress, sandhills is a type of oligotrophic soil that could be suitable for cypress. So yeah, absolutely, that's what that is up there. Definitely. Okay, well, I'm sorry again to not have left more time, but I think at this point we're gonna take a quick bio break. If you want to come back and if you're gonna stay on for the Santa Cruz wallflower talk, which is gonna come around the hills, we thought it would be more efficient to do them all at once. Yay! So we'll run into a talk about a multi-year introduction project for Santa Cruz wallflower in the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve. For those of you who are interested in wallflower, thanks for joining, and we'll hopefully be in touch to talk about more next steps. If you want to come back at 3:05, 3:07 maybe, we will get started then.